Good evening, and welcome to our first class in the series on the Exodus, the journey that made us. Tonight's class is sponsored in memory of Reb Dov Ber, Reb Tzvi Hirsch. May his soul have an aliyah. This is a short class. 3-4 hours, I think, is enough. But the reason why we're doing Exodus is, number one, you don't need a reason to do the Exodus, because it's a mitzvah to remember the Exodus every day. So every day is good to talk about the Exodus, but there's another reason, because we're beginning to read the Torah portion that deals with the Exodus. We're starting to read the book of Exodus, and the theme of the book, of course, is the Exodus. But that raises a little bit of a question. Why do we focus so much on an event that happened 3,300 plus years ago? Why do we live in the past? Are we that nostalgic? So the classic response is that we have to learn lessons from history. And there's truth to that assertion. But as the famous German philosopher Heschel said, that the lesson that we learn from history, or the only lesson we learn from history, is that we don't learn lessons from history. Actually, he said it in a positive vein, that you cannot really learn lessons from history because every event is different, is unique. But Judaism doesn't necessarily agree with Hegel about that. We believe that we could learn lessons from history, and it's incumbent upon us to learn history, especially our own history. But that's still not the ultimate answer. The ultimate answer, the one that Hasidic thought emphasizes over and over again, is that we're not really commemorating the past. This is not nostalgia. What we're doing is reliving the past, recreating the energy that brought about the events of the past in the present. In other words, when we learn about the Exodus, we are going through the process of the Exodus. And as we'll discover, the more we learn about the Exodus, is that we're talking about ourselves, not necessarily just our ancestors. We're talking about ourselves, and we're talking about today, January 2026, because it's not something that happened, it's something that is happening. These forces that are responsible for the Exodus are recurring, are regenerated as we speak. That's one point. Another point, the prophet Micha, one of the biblical prophets, states, as in the days that you left from Egypt, I will show them wonders. In other words, besides going into the idea that God will show us wonders in the future, but it says the days that you left Egypt. It's phrased in the plural. How we left Egypt in one day. Why did he use the term the days? Because we're still leaving Egypt. Egypt is not just a geographic location. Egypt is a mindset. Egypt is a state of mind that we are constantly required to take leave of those things that confine us and experience our own exodus. What are examples of freedom that we have to enjoy today? We're, thank God, living in a free country. We're not slaves, but we are. For example, addictions. Mm-hmm. We are, more than any other generation, I think, in the past, we are addicted to all sorts of things, including and mostly technology. Mm-hmm. And the more that technology advances, the more addicted we become to that technology. I can imagine in a few years from now, people will not be able to do anything without AI. AI will just control their lives totally. It's already starting to control our lives. So we have to learn how to liberate ourselves from the type of bondage that exists today. So, number one, we're not just commemorating an event of the past, we're reliving the experience. And number two, we are, in a certain sense, in our own little Egypt, in our own little Mitzrayim. The word Mitzrayim, which is the Hebrew word for Egypt, and is an Arabic name that's similar to it, actually comes from a root that means constraints. Anytime you're constrained, anytime there's something that imposes its limits on you, anytime you can't break out of a certain mold, that's what calls for the Exodus. That's what calls for liberation. And that's why we focus so much on the Exodus. To remember the Exodus, and we do remember it every day, is a biblical commandment. We have here a quote on page 2. I am the Lord your God. I'm sorry, the end of page 1, Deuteronomy, that you may remember the day when you went out of the land of Egypt, all the days of your life. From this, our sages derived that every day of our lives, we're supposed to remember that we were liberated from Egypt every single day. And not only every single day, but according to one opinion in the Mishna, every single day and every single night. We're supposed to remember the Exodus. Another opinion says, not only do we remember the Exodus now, but when Mashiach will come and there will be a greater Exodus than the one from Egypt, we'll still remember the Exodus from Egypt. It'll still have significance. What are these two opinions? What's the deeper understanding of these two opinions? The one that says we have to remember it at night, some people could say, okay, when it's day, when it's light, when things are going well, I can talk about the Exodus, I can talk about freedom. But if I'm not free, if I'm living in the night, in the dark, why should I remember the Exodus? I'm not free. I'm a slave. A person who has suffering from an addiction, a person who's suffering from things that don't let him or her break out of a mold, why would you mention the Exodus? The answer is yes. Even when it's night, you still mention the Exodus. And then another person could argue, when it's so light, the light of Mashiach will be so great, why will we mention a minor liberation of the past? No, it'll still have significance. It'll always have significance. And not only does it have significance, but it is also a very fundamental part of Judaism. Judaism has 613 commandments, but nevertheless, this commandment seems to be singled out for special emphasis. The 10 Commandments begins with the words. These are the first words that God spoke to the Jewish people. The first of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God, who has taken you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. So the very first introduction, God says, hello, I'm here. I want you to acknowledge me. And God describes himself. How does he describe himself? As the Liberator. And the question is asked, the famous philosopher and poet, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, asked this question. He says, why does it say, I am God who took you out of the land of Egypt? It should have said, I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth. And there are many answers to this question, and we'll talk about a few of them. The Ibn Ezra, 11th century sage, 11th, 12th century sage, wrote a commentary on the Torah. So he says that it's to impress upon us that nature is not absolute, because God preceded creation of the world. He was here before there was a universe, and he created nature. And therefore he has the power to alter nature. That's what God wants us to know, that you are not fixed. Just like God is not fixed and constrained, so too we are not constrained. We are not fixed. We could break out of any boundary. We can break out of any shackles that limit us. We have the power to break out because God is the one who broke out of boundaries, took us out of those boundaries. And another point that Ibn Ezra makes is the knowledge of God from creation is for more intellectually minded people. People who are more philosophically inclined. So they would be impressed when they talk about creation. But for the average person, when you tell them that God created the universe, he says, okay, big deal. The universe is here already. Why do I care about that he created it? Who knows when? But for the average person, the Exodus is meaningful, that God could take you out of your problems, He can take you out of your limits, He can take you out of your bondage. That's something that impresses the average individual. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the one who originally proposed this question, he says this is to focus on the uniqueness of the Jewish people. This is a very parochial aspect of Judaism, that God has a special relationship with the Jewish people. God relates to the whole universe and to all humanity, but He has a special relationship with the Jewish people. If we would have said God is the creator of heaven and earth, that would be a universal aspect of God. And Judaism wants us to have that universal aspect of God, that God is not just here for the Jewish people, He's here for the whole universe, but He wants us to also have a special relationship with the Jewish people, which we develop and cultivate by remembering the Exodus from Egypt. There's more, but I'm going to go on to the next subject. Why do we focus on the bondage? We're soon going to be celebrating Pesach. Before you know it, it's going to be Passover. By the time we finish this series, we're going to be preparing and cleaning our house for Passover. I'm sorry if I ruined your night by reminding you of all the work for Passover. But if you look at the Seder, we put so much emphasis on the bondage, not just the liberation, but the bondage itself. And if you look at the items of the Seder, take the matzah. Matzah is called bread of affliction. It's a poor man's bread. It's a bread of affliction. Maror, the bitter herbs, are bitter. It's to remind us of the bitterness. Charosis reminds us of the mortar that they had to make when they were slaves in Egypt. The karpas, the parsley or the vegetable we dip in salt water, the word karpas has in it the word perech, which is back-breaking labor. So it reminds us of the back-breaking labor. The salt water is said, I don't know what the source is, but everyone says it, is the symbol of the tears that we shed in Egypt. So almost every item of the Seder, except for the wine, though I can't think of anything except when you drink too much wine, you end up in a bad state. But that's not why we drink wine. What?
Maybe the blood.
Oh, okay. Right, the charosas, the mortar, the custom is to make it out of fruit, apples, pears, and nuts, but we also add wine to it. Why do we add the wine? This is a little gory, because when the Jewish people could not produce enough mortar for the bricks, they would take babies, Jewish babies, and crush them into the mortar. And to remind us of how horrible it was, we add wine, a little color, reddish color, to the charosas. Just as historically speaking, there was a time when Jews did not use red wine because they were accused of using Christian blood for matzah. So to have red wine was dangerous, and people didn't use red wine, they used white wine, so they didn't serve that purpose. But anyhow, why do we focus that much on the bondage? And the answer is that you can't appreciate freedom without experiencing the absence of it. Try to tell a child growing up in suburbia about suffering and pain that we suffered in Egypt, or even tell them about the Holocaust. It's very hard for someone who's growing up in an affluent society, in a free society, with all of its problems. We're still living in the best country, in the best period of human history. And it's hard to imagine how any time in history could match what we have today, what we're enjoying today, with all of its problems. We can't appreciate the liberation without first understanding what it is to be deprived, what it is to be in a state of pain and suffering and bondage. That's why we focus that much on the bondage, so we appreciate the freedom. The bondage, you're not going to get out of bondage unless you know you're in it. Because on one hand, we don't feel we're in bondage, but if you start to reflect on the problems that we have, then we begin to realize that we too have our own forms of bondage. And the bondage, another point, the bondage, why did they have to be slaves in Egypt? What was the reason God wanted the Jewish people to be enslaved? There are many explanations why they ended up in Egypt as slaves, but one of the explanations is that it was like the crucible that refined them and prepared them to receive the Torah. God could not just give the Jewish people the Torah and expect them to be able to implement it. They had to go through a refining process. And that refining process involved the suffering and the pain. The Talmud says there were three things that were given to the Jewish people through suffering. One of them is the Torah. The other one is Israel, the land of Israel, and the third one is the Messianic age. And the suffering that precedes the Messianic age is the suffering that the Jewish people have been going through in recent times. But the first thing is the Torah. In order for us to appreciate the Torah, to be prepared for it, we had to go through a refinement process, which is what the bondage was all about. And just to amplify this point, God is choosing the Jewish people as a nation, entrusting them with a master plan for the world, which is called the Torah. And we're supposed to we're not here to convert everyone to Judaism, but we're here to be a light to the nations, to inspire the nations to become more godly. In order to achieve that, we have to have the ability not to lose our identities. If we lose our identities, then how could we affect others? How could we inspire others? And we'll lose the very reason that we were chosen in order to become a special, chosen nation. So God wanted the Jewish people to have this ability to withstand all sorts of pressures. There are two primary forces that oppose our ability to be what we are supposed to be. There's the force of persecution, of oppression, and the force of assimilation. Oppression takes its toll on the people. When people are suffering physically, materially, they can't maintain their highest standards because they're going through terrible pain and suffering. And assimilation, the enticement of being like everyone else, also undermines your ability to be what you're destined to be. So God wanted, when the Jewish people are being forged into a nation that has to endure, God knew that they're going to be exposed to these two influences, to the influence of persecution and the influence of assimilation. So God puts them through that for 210 years. They're persecuted, they're terribly oppressed by enslavement and torture, and at the same time, God also allowed them to be exposed to the assimilation, the forces of assimilation of being like the Egyptians. And our sages tell us that the Jewish people barely survived that experience. They came out of 50 levels of impurity. They went down to the 49th level, but they didn't go down to the 50th level. They still maintained their identity. And that will lead us to the name of the book of Exodus. We just call the book Exodus, but that's not how it's called in the Jewish community. That's a secondary name. The name of this book that we're going to be reviewing is, does anyone know the name? Shemot, or Shmos. And what does that word mean?
Names.
Names. Isn't that an odd name to give a book? The name of the book is Names. Now, what is the book about? The book has three or four main themes. The book of Exodus, or Names, has the story of the slavery, of the bondage, and the Exodus. We'll lump that together as one. Then it has the story, the narrative of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. That's a central topic, if not the most central topic of the whole Torah. And the third one is the construction of a sanctuary known as the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary, which was the forerunner of the temple in Jerusalem, but this was a portable one that they transported took with them in their travels. So those are the three major themes of the book of Exodus. Wouldn't it make more sense that the name of the book should be Exodus, or Sinai, or Sanctuary? One of those names that reflect the very major themes of the book. And the most likely name should have been Exodus, which is actually in Jewish circles, it is referred to in Hebrew as Sefer HaGeula, the book of Exodus, of liberation. But that's not its primary name. A primary name is names. So why would that be a primary name for this book? And this ties in with what we just spoke about, that the greatest pressure for a people to survive is to withstand the pressures of assimilation. When the Jewish people in Egypt were subjected to slavery for 210 years, there was a great likelihood for them to totally assimilate. And the Torah tells us, how does the book of Exodus begin? It begins with the words, these are the names, in the page 5 you have in bold, and these are the names of the children of Israel who came into Egypt. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, it goes on to list all the 12 names of the 12 sons of Jacob. Why does the Torah, the book of Exodus, begin? Because it wants to emphasize that it was the names that they did not change. The Jewish people stayed in Egypt. Maybe they followed many Egyptian customs, but they didn't change their identities. They maintained who they were. Their names had not changed. That's why we put such an emphasis on having Jewish names and remembering our Jewish names and using them. And it's interesting that in Hebrew, this translation is not accurate. Who came into Egypt. It doesn't say who came, it says Haba'im, who are coming in Egypt. In other words, every day that they were in Egypt, it was like the first day they came there, because they never left from where they originated. They never left their identities behind. They always remembered who they were. And if you remember your identity, that's when you could be free, and that's when you could receive the Torah, and that's when you can build a sanctuary. If you don't remember your name, which means if you don't have an identity, you don't know who you are, and there are many people who walk around who don't really know who they are. They have no sense of who they really are. If you don't know who you are, you can't be liberated. Why not? Because if you don't have an identity, your identity becomes every other influence in this world. A person who doesn't have a self-respect and an identity will absorb the identities from others. You'll pick things up from the local culture. If the local culture has this crazy fad or something, that will become your identity. If the culture has another fad, you'll absorb and assimilate every influence that comes your way. So you're never going to be free. You're always going to have other masters that define you, not the way who you are, but define you the way they are. So if you want to be free, you have to retain your name, not just literally your name, but your identity. In those days, the only identity they could retain was their name. You can't receive the Torah. You can't surrender. What is receiving the Torah? Embracing God's will and saying, I'm surrendering my life to God. If you don't have an identity, who are you surrendering? There's nothing to surrender. There's nothing there. And you can't rebuild a sanctuary, because the whole idea of a sanctuary is that you're receiving, you're internalizing something holy. God says, build for me a sanctuary and I will dwell in them. Them means the people. The sanctuary was the channel through which God dwells in us. If there's no us, if we don't know who we are, if you don't have a vessel, you're not going to be able to receive something. Who is the role model for this resistance to assimilation? Joseph. That's why the Torah starts off by saying that Joseph, all those descended from Jacob were 70 souls, and Joseph was in Egypt. And the great commentator Rashi, the 11th century commentator, the most important commentary on the Torah, says that this is to teach us that even though he was a king, he was the viceroy, the prime minister, second to the king himself, he did not change. He didn't become Egyptian. He retained his identity as a son of Jacob and the grandson of Isaac and Abraham. Just for the sake of giving everyone an idea what this Torah portion is about, we're not going to cover the whole Torah portion. We're going to cover just a little part of it. At the very beginning, the Torah describes how the bondage started, that Pharaoh got nervous when he saw how the Jews were proliferating, how many Jews were being born. We'll go into that in a moment. So what does he do? He says to his advisors, let's figure out a way to deal with them. Let's enslave them and crush them. That didn't work, so he says, let's get the midwives, the Jewish midwives, to kill all the boys at the time of their birth. That didn't work. He says, let's throw all the boys in the Nile. And at that point, Moses is born, and the whole story about how he was saved from being thrown in the Nile by being put into the Nile, which is the irony there. His mother put him in a basket in the Nile, and he was saved by Batya, or Bitya, the daughter of Pharaoh, and raised in the palace of Pharaoh. And then Moses sees how his brothers, when he grows up, how he's being tortured. He kills an Egyptian taskmaster, and he has to flee. And he comes to Midian, and he gets married to the daughter of the local high priest, Jethro. And he's tending his sheep, and he comes to a place which turns out to be Mount Sinai. And he sees a burning bush, and God speaks to him through an angel and tells him that he should be the one to liberate the Jews from Egypt. That's, in a nutshell, the text. And Moses refuses to become the leader, the liberator. He argues with God, and God finally imposes himself on him, and he finally accepts the responsibility. So the Torah begins in this week's Torah portion with saying how the Jewish people proliferated. Proliferation, growth, is a source of strength. You know, we're living in an age where people are worried about overpopulating the earth. Judaism never worried about that. And I'm not going to go into that whole subject, but when the Jews were in Egypt, Pharaoh thought by oppressing them, they're going to diminish in size, in number. Not only did they not diminish, but they grew even more. The verse over here on page 6, and the children of Israel were fruitful and proliferated and multiplied and grew very, very strong. How many expressions are there? Fruitful, proliferated, multiplied, grew, very, very strong. So there's 6 expressions. So our sages tell us, and Rashi quotes this, that women would give birth to sextuplets. And in the course of 210 years, from 70 souls, how many Jews left Egypt? We don't have the exact number. We know that there were 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. So if you do a little math, you probably have an equal number of women of that age. So that already gives you 1,200,000. Then you have to talk about all the children up to the age of 20 and all the senior citizens. So we estimate, many estimate between 2 and 3 million people in 210 years. That was tremendous proliferation. And that's the third threat to Jewish survival. The first 2 threats are persecution, assimilation. The third threat is low birth rate. Low birth rates will, God forbid, do the same terrible job that persecution could do and assimilation can do. And that's one of the problems that the Jewish community suffers from. We suffer from too few. Some rabbi once had a large family. I know rabbis that have large families. And someone asked him, when are you going to stop having kids? And he said, when I have 6 million. So as Jews, we don't have to worry about overpopulation. We're underpopulated. Then it says, and there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. Now, there were 2 opinions as to who this Pharaoh was. Some say it was actually a new king. Others say it was the same king with new decrees, who knew not Joseph, who acted as if he didn't know Joseph. So what's the point of these 2 opinions? The first opinion says it was the same Pharaoh. Why is it important to know that? Because it shows how people could lose gratitude and show no gratitude for all the good that they have been given. Egypt was literally saved from extinction by Joseph. by the Ivrim, by the Hebrews, as they were then called. And here you go and you persecute that family. They saved you. So the Torah is trying to tell us that one of the characteristics of exile, of bondage, is a moral type of bondage. Bondage is not just physical conditions that you're a slave and you can't function the way you want to. It's moral bondage. That Egypt was the nadir, the very lowest form of morality, and that manifested itself in that no gratitude. And to be an ingrate is a sign that you're really just totally selfish and self-centered, and that's a form of exile as well. How do you enslave a people? These were honored citizens, the Hebrews, and all of a sudden they become lowly slaves. So our sages tell us, this is the oral traditions that were passed down, that it didn't happen overnight. And on page 7 you have the whole story. Pharaoh himself took hold of a basket and shovel. All who saw Pharaoh with a basket and shovel working in bricks did likewise. If you see your king lowering himself, it's not beneath his dignity to act as a simple laborer. So Jews are very patriotic. It's one of the things that Jews distinguish themselves throughout history, that they are patriotic to the host country, even if the host country was not very nice to them. So here Pharaoh was working so hard, the Jews said, let's emulate what he's doing. The Jews came to and diligently worked with him all day, for they were strong and brawny. When evening fell, Pharaoh placed taskmasters over them and said, count how many bricks they made. He then said to the Hebrews, this number you shall deliver to me each and every day. In other sources, it makes it a little bit more dramatic, that he started paying them for their work. So they were more than happy to volunteer to help rebuild Egypt. It was a major national cause to rebuild Egypt, and Jews were working very hard, and they were very proud of their ability to produce such nice structures. And then little by little, Pharaoh withdrew, the Egyptians withdrew from the effort, and now the Jews are regimented into a workforce that they couldn't get out of. How were they oppressed? The Torah uses the word perech that I mentioned before. Literally, the word perech is back-breaking labor. But the Talmud tells us that they actually used deception, which is what we just went through before. They had to use deception. Also, we eat bitter herbs at the Seder. What specific food do we eat to serve as bitter herbs? So most people will tell you horseradish. There's nothing more bitter than horseradish. But actually, the Talmud says that there are 5 kinds of vegetables, 5 species that qualify as bitter herbs. And you could use any of those 5. We only know 2 for sure what the 2 are. One is bitter herbs, horseradish. And the other one, which is the preferred one, is romaine lettuce. And some people have accustomed to use both. But if you have a choice of romaine lettuce or horseradish, it's preferable to use romaine lettuce. And everyone asks the question, and the Talmud anticipates this question, but romaine lettuce is not bitter. And the Talmud answers, if you leave the plant very long in the ground, it becomes extremely bitter. We don't let it stay that long because we don't want to have it bitter. So why is that preferred? Because that's exactly how slavery developed. It started very sweet, very pleasant, and little by little it grew into something terribly bitter. So we're supposed to remember not just the bitterness, but we're supposed to remember also how it came about through deception. Because sometimes you could be a slave, not physically, that you're tortured physically, but your mind is enslaved. They enslave your mind. You can't think clearly. You're duped into doing things that are harmful. That's the symbolism that's found in the romaine lettuce. Another thing the Talmud says is that they gave people useless work. They had to build structures. There's a whole debate whether we built it pyramids or not, but the Torah doesn't mention anything about pyramids. But it does mention that the structures that they built, the Talmud explains, did not stand. They would, as soon as they would finish building a beautiful structure, they would sink into the ground and fall apart. And then they would have to rebuild it. Why did they do that? That was deliberate on their part. That was psychological torture. Because if you give a slave a mission to build something, at least they get some satisfaction that they built something that has value. But if you tell a slave to build something and then the thing collapses, they don't feel any satisfaction. They get nothing out of it. So that's psychological torture. They tell the story of a very wealthy man sees this peasant taking a sickle and cutting grain. And he asks him, how much do you make? He said a very paltry amount, let's say $10 an hour. He says, come to my house and I'll give you the same work to make the motions that you're cutting grain, and I'll pay you $100 an hour. The guy was thrilled. $100 an hour? He comes to his house and says, where's the grain that you want me to cut? No, I don't know grain. I just want you to go like this with your sickle, make believe you're cutting grain. Within a half hour, the guy quit. He says, how could I do this? But you're making $100 an hour, but I don't see any results. I don't get any satisfaction. That's human nature. Even if you're forced into something, you want to be able to show. I visit the prisons. I've visited a prison in the past on a weekly basis, and you see the prisoners taking pride in gardening and doing other things. They're slaves. They're actually slaves. But they still take pride because they're doing something. They're manufacturing things. They make different pieces of furniture and things like that. So that was the psychological torture. So there was physical torture, there was psychological torture, and another example of psychological torture. Nowadays people will say there's no difference, but there was a difference, and there probably still is. Men like certain types of work, and women like certain types of work. They would make the women do men's work, and the men do women's work, to make them feel that what they're doing is not natural. It was, again, a form of psychological torture.
Why does it say the Holy Spirit says that on the bottom of page 8?
Right.
What Holy Spirit are we talking about?
That's God. The Holy Spirit is another way of saying God. In the Torah, it doesn't say that. In the Torah, it says that Pharaoh said he's going to oppress them, and so that they don't proliferate. And then God is the one who says, you say, lest they multiply, but I say, so will they multiply. That's how the Talmud and Rashi explains it. By the way, we eat an egg at the Seder. That's the way we start the meal. Why do we eat an egg? There are a lot of reasons for it. But there's one reason given by a 19th century rabbi known as the Chassam Sofer. He says, every food that you cook, the longer you cook it, the softer it gets. There's one notable exception, an egg. The longer you cook the egg, the harder it gets. The Jewish people are like an egg. The more you torture them, the more you oppress them, the harder they get, the tougher they get. What does the expression go? When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Well, that's exactly what the hard-boiled egg demonstrates. And reminds me of a cute little anecdote. In the yeshiva in France, where my wife comes from, they hired a Russian Jew who never saw, he was in Siberia, he was a prisoner, and he used to, for breakfast, he would make hard-boiled eggs. That's the one thing he knew how to make. So every day, hard-boiled eggs. So the student said, could you give us a little variation? What do you want? Can one day give us a soft-boiled egg? I said, sure, why not? Next day, hard-boiled egg. Next day, a hard-boiled egg. So they said, why can't you give us soft-boiled eggs? I do. I make sure to leave the mashul a few minutes earlier so I can start cooking the eggs a few minutes earlier. So it cooks longer to get it soft. He never saw a soft-boiled egg. But we are hard-boiled eggs, and the more they oppress us, the stronger we become. And that's the response to the terrorism that we suffered in Sydney and among all the other terrorist acts. They think they're going to weaken us. They think they're going to destroy us. They think, oh, we're finished. No, we're not finished. We have just begun. And the Jewish people will get stronger and stronger. So the anti-Semites should know, you want us to get weak? Don't bother us. If you stop bothering us and you don't attack us and you don't hate us, we might, God forbid, get weaker. So it's better for you, if you don't like us, to stop oppressing us.